And they said, look, we would rather die trying than die here. The campaign was so effective, it reached many of the most high-profile footballers around the world, Didier Drogba and Trezeguet and Chiellini, and they all supported him. Then owner of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, flew to Australia and requested an hour of my time that we sit down. He wanted to understand how I ran the campaign on his platform.
What's up, everybody? You're listening to Tech for Impact podcast by Freedom World. Welcome to the show. My name is Darren.
Hey, everyone. I'm Ben.
And we're back. Today's guest is a very interesting person. We had Craig Foster, the world-renowned soccer player, former Socceroo captain, one of Australia's most respected footballers. He's also a renowned human rights activist, known for leading global campaigns for refugees and marginalized communities.
In fact, right now, as we're recording this, I know that he is in Bangladesh, in one of the largest refugee camps in the world. We're living in 2025, and to think that people are still being kept behind fences as refugees is really, really sad.
In today's episode, we're going to be talking about a lot of Craig's experiences in activism, and I think the topic of today's conversation stems from the insight of how communities can move and empower movements and make social good.
I mean, the power of community is phenomenal, and I think he leveraged it amazingly well. Behind all of that, it's the power of social media as a technology and the power of community, especially the football community that came together to make a change. And it's amazing what you can do. And I think that's the key takeaway that's there. But let's dive into our discussion.
Let's not give too much spoilers. Let's dive right into our conversation with Craig.
So Craig, you're a former Socceroo captain. How do you jump from being a captain all the way to human rights activism? And what was the journey like for you?
When I was pretty young, I already was starting to work with homeless people, women facing domestic violence in Australia. I was a young player, and we had opportunities to kind of go out into the community and do some promotional work. And I started to get to know these programs. I started to get a better understanding of what people were facing around us, because sports people are very cloistered, if you like, in a professional environment, which is entirely modified and regulated in the pursuit of athletic high performance. And once you step outside that, you see that the world is very different. And people can respond to that in different ways. My response was, I need to understand more about this, about where I'm sitting and why people don't have the same rights or are treated in the same way or face racism or any other thing. But throughout that time, I supported many, many programs. And eventually, as you grow older, you go from just as an athlete, and many just lend their name to a particular program and say, look, I support this, I think this is important. And then it might be sitting on the board and actually supporting them, or it might be even providing finance. Thirdly, it becomes about public advocacy. And fourthly, it becomes about policy, which is usually advocating to government. So that was my progression as well. So I was studying law as well. I ended up finishing that many years later. And that kind of played into it.
It's not very often that you kind of find people who've played, and that too at a national level, and then say, oh, you know what, I want to do law. Was it driven from the perspective that, hey, I want to help people, or was it just like out of an interest completely?
It was driven from a sense of, justice and injustice that I'd seen around me. I started when I was young, only 19. I started out of school here in Australia, and I simply couldn't finish it because this sport kind of takes you to another level on a regular basis. So I was here in Australia at the national level when I was 17, and the following year, when I was 18 or something like that, I started law, and then all of a sudden you're in, the youth national team, and then you're traveling the world, and then you make the national team, and then you go abroad, and so all these things make it very difficult. Unlike today, where it's all online anyway. So athletes today have no excuse not to become educated academically as well and about the world. Whereas in our day, I'm going back to the late 80s here, it simply wasn't available. You had to actually go to university, and that was very difficult to coordinate with an international sporting career. I was captain at Crystal Palace in England for a while. And even there, I went back to law school because at that time it had become online and I was just doing one unit at a time, so I was committed to finishing. But anyway, I ended up finishing later. And having studied human rights, I then understood it much better. I understood the international legal framework, the importance of that, the drawbacks of that as well, and the shortfalls of the particular system that we currently have. And I started to support Amnesty International, the biggest human rights organizations in the world, and then to advocate for human rights in and through sport. So, for example, advocating to FIFA for its own human rights policy around the Qatar World Cup, for example, around the 6,000 migrant workers who died. So all of these things have been a big focus. They're all very much interlinked.
So Ben, you can see how Craig's experience as a leader on the soccer field has helped him gain this much experience or this much know-how in navigating the complexities of like international law.
I think the next story is an interesting one where, a bunch of 15 girls were in great danger from the Taliban regime. And it's a very scary story that, 15 lives decided, and that too young girls, they decided that, hey, we're going to do this or die trying.
Yeah.
And, it's easy to say it sitting in a nice chair somewhere, listening to this podcast in a car or whatever. But when you've got bullets flying across and, your life is really under threat, that's a very different ballgame.
It's a totally different ballgame. Let's jump into it.
There are many conflicts around the world and moments and times when people are at risk, but some just have particular elements that just kind of, share things and say, listen, this is important. These people are being hurt here and we should do something. But actually getting actively involved and moving people is a different matter. And what happened in Afghanistan was the actual women's national football team was at risk. And so most things that tend to come to me is where people see an intersection of human rights and sport. And I was aware of this team because they'd had issues in the preceding years whereby they had faced various sexual assault and other cases. They'd taken a case to FIFA and so on. And when the decision was made by US to pull out of Afghanistan and then everything started to go to hell, they were at risk largely because they were the most visible women's sporting team in Afghanistan. And of course, the Taliban don't support or don't believe in women's participation in civic or political life at all, and part of which is sport. And they had actually led a case against their own officials of the Afghan Football Association for sexual assault. So they were at severe risk, they were at mortal risk. So they had to get the hell out. As it happened at that time, the Australian government wanted to respond because we were a party to that. We were one of the allied forces who were involved in Afghanistan. And we had used Afghanistan people as interpreters and other things, and we had relationship with them. And our former defence veterans in Australia were saying, these people helped us be safe on the ground. They're our friends. We need to help them. So the Australian government was under pressure to actually get some people out, not just Australians. And therefore, the Australian government had to decide what kind of people are we going to get out. And then they say, what's the people most at risk? That is women, that is girls, and that's these particular ethnicities, Hazara, the ones who are deemed to be most at risk. The first one was the Afghan women's national team, and then there was a young bunch of girls. So we got the Afghan women's national team out. And then what happened is the immigration minister of Australia had said that I could have a number of visas because they were trying to work with what they call trusted people because it was happening so quickly. And then at this stage, I had about 30 visas. They'd said, listen, there's only 24 hours and then we're going to have to close it off because all flights are going to be gone because the airport is too dangerous. And what happened was, I got a call from the Australian government, said, listen, everyone that you're trying to get out, get away from the airport immediately because there's going to be a terrorist event. And so I had to tell these girls and many other footballers, you need to get away immediately. Something's going to occur and our intelligence is saying it's going to be bad and you need to get everyone away. So I was on WhatsApp telling all these kids, I'm sorry, you must get away immediately or I can't help you. They got out, they just got away like a couple of kilometres. And the next morning we woke up here in Australia and there had been a terror bombing. And I think about 60 odd people were killed. Because the Australian government knew that was happening, they actually pulled everyone out anyway. So now, whilst I had the visas, we couldn't get out on planes anymore. So now we had to work out how to get these kids out across the Pakistan border. And so that was a whole process in itself. And so the kids hid in a house, and the Taliban were coming around, knocking on rooms, trying to get young girls, take them for the troops. We were on the phone to these young girls, 15 young girls, and they said to us, listen, if these people get in, we're going to take our own lives. And we said, well, Jesus, like, what do you say to that? Anyway, they said, listen, should we try to get to the border? And we said, look, we can't advise you. It's up to you. And they said, look, we would rather die trying than die here. A documentary was made of that journey, and it's called Die or Die Trying. That are your two options. You know, if you stay, you're going to die. You might die trying, but you're better off doing it. That's the decision the kids took. We were able to get them there. It was very, very dangerous and so on. But ultimately, they got out. Australian government took people to Qatar, and eventually they're here. They're all in university now studying, so they're all very bright young kids. And they speak in schools now, a number of them. They go around to schools, talk to young people here about what they faced, about women's rights. Very, very powerful group. And so, yeah, the documentary is online. It's on YouTube. It's called Die or Die Trying, Escaping the Taliban. And it just tells the story of a community group here in Sydney, in Australia, who came together, and the power of good people just deciding that, we think something needs to happen here. And you never know how much impact you can make until you actually try.
Hey guys, this episode was brought to you by Freedom World app. It is a gamified social platform where you can join communities around a variety of interests, popular brands, events, and much more. You can immerse yourself in the community that's filled with activities and connect with like-minded individuals who share your passion. It's also the perfect platform for small businesses, content creators, or anyone looking to create a community. You'll find a variety of tools and features ranging from news feeds and your own online store to creating branded tokens and AI-generated content that will help you engage, monetize, and grow your community. Download Freedom World on the Apple App Store or Google Play Store and create your world today.
I think the next story that Craig shares is where things really come together. All his experience as a footballer and as a Socceroo captain and usage of all that technology, the community. Believe me, the football community is crazy and, really, really one that stands for one of their own. And this story is about the fight for someone's basic human rights.
I think he's aware that he has a platform, he has a following, he chose to give his platform like a purpose and meaning. And that's how he's able to make the decision to use it for good and use his leadership skills to rally people. I think it's a treat in and of itself to know that you have that and to consciously use it for good. I mean, he has so many stories, right, that he's telling about. And I think that the most poignant part is like, what do you do when you know you can do something? I think it must have gone through Kick's head in the next story.
So let's dive in and let's not keep people hanging, but let's dive in and listen to what he has to say.
His name was Hakim Al-Arabi. He actually was a refugee granted protection by Australia. He was in Melbourne and he played football. He actually was a member of the under-23 national Bahraini football team. So he was a talented right back. And then what had happened is in the Arab Spring, he'd been incarcerated because he protested for democracy, and as many people did, and he had to flee. And he came to Australia. He was granted immunity, actually. He got married, and then he went off to Bangkok for his honeymoon. When the flight landed on Bangkok airport on the runway, the immigration police boarded the flight. They grabbed him, they put him in detention, and a couple of days later put him in a prison. And he was in extreme danger. And people in Australia came to me for the obvious reason that, I was a prominent figure of the sporting community, of his sport as well, which is football. I was a broadcaster, everyone knows me, and I was the most prominent human rights advocate in that space. And they said, listen, this kid's in trouble here. And so I had a look at it. I met his wife. His wife explained to me what was going on. I read his case. I knew that he was innocent. I decided to try and help him in every way I could. And effectively, I ran a campaign with a whole range of organisations. We reached over 30 million people over the course of only 77 days. We effectively were able to pressure three governments in order to release him. In fact, the campaign was so effective, it reached many of the most high-profile current and former footballers around the world, Didier Drogba and Trezeguet and Chiellini and names that are household names in football. They all supported him eventually after the campaign grew, and they were on Twitter, as it was known at the time, saying this and this because we were calling on FIFA to help him. I went to Bangkok twice. I flew to Zurich to meet with FIFA and basically demanded a meeting. And ultimately, we were able to get him out. In fact, the following year, then owner of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, flew to Australia and requested an hour of my time that we sit down. He wanted to understand how I ran the campaign on his platform and offered to create any additional tools for Twitter advocacy, for social justice and human rights advocacy, in order to, allow me to continue to make this sort of impact on his social media platform. Of course, today we're in a very different context with Elon Musk.
I totally understand that because the big part of this would have been getting the community involved. Like you mentioned that he's a footballer himself. I think it cascaded from there, right? From the football community to the commercial community. Then it became everyone online as well. So I just wanted to underscore the importance of community. I really feel like they rally behind you first.
So there are a whole vast range of communities, kind of concentric circles within any society and within the world. And one of those is sport. And of course, that has intersections across a whole range of other communities. There are refugees in sport, and sport has its own circle, right? So the first thing, because he was not only a refugee, but he played a particular sport of football, and I was in football, that allowed me to immediately speak to the football community in Australia and then extrapolate that out to the global football community. So ultimately, we got our professional teams involved in Australia in advocacy, holding up banners before games and things very quickly in the first 2 weeks. And then we got our national teams involved. It happened that they were playing games, or some of those members just on social media hold up a card. So we were able to get in touch with them, being former players ourselves, and say, listen, here's what we'd like you to say. If you're prepared to support him, just say blah, blah, blah. So they would then share something. Of course, the community and outside of sport sees their sporting heroes doing that. It starts to become cool to support this because this is like the right thing to do, and people like to overwhelmingly be a part of something that's grounded in goodness. So everyone started to kind of pile on, if you like. And then there's some key moments that you can build off in advocacy. You need those triggers as well to build the emotion. So, for example, when he first went to court, I was there as the bus pulled up. He was the last to get off. He was barefoot and they had shackles on his ankles.
Oh, horrible.
Goodness.
Yeah, so this image went around the world, and certainly sporting people all around the world said, "How can this happen in 2019? How can this kid be in shackles? This is arcane. Something's wrong." And those moments can be very important. And in advocacy, you need to utilize what's at your disposal and those moments to really then trigger a much, much greater response at scale. And that's when we trended. We trended on Twitter globally.
I think it's a testament to how far belonging to a community and how far that can actually take us as individuals. And you mentioned that you achieved this under 77 days. What happened at the end? What was the outcome? Because it's an amazing story.
Yeah, so in the end, after 77 days, he was released. I was working with the Australian government, particularly with our foreign minister, very closely, and I flew down late at night. That night, I flew down to Melbourne, and he arrived early the next morning on a flight straight from Bangkok. He stepped off the flight, and we had hundreds of people. By that time, once he was on the flight, we could say on social media, "Okay, look, we're delighted to be able to say thank you to everyone. This is what's happened. He's going to be arriving tomorrow morning." And hundreds of people turned up at Melbourne Airport to see his arrival. There was press crews there, and we had a press conference, and so it was a pretty big deal.
This was a full-on movement. It wasn't just like activism. This was like, get everybody on the streets type Martin Luther King style movement.
Well, we had to do it at a whole range of levels. So you had grassroots community, that was a sport community, and then normal community. So, we mapped it all out pretty quickly. Okay, this is what it's going to have to look like. This is the elements we're going to have to go. I'll be responsible for all these. I need you people to work on these. What are the international organizations that we can co-opt? we had now had access to millions of people through social media. So what were we going to ask them to do? And that was a range of things. So for example, human rights organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they want you to sign petitions and letters because that's powerful because it shows numbers. You can do polls, you can show the number of people who are supporting, retweets of something and all these things. And so all of that data you can pull together. And so I was able to just jump on a plane, land in Zurich, go to FIFA House, sit in front of the General Secretary of FIFA and say, here's the petitions. Here's like 150,000 petitions from Australia alone. We've got 2.5 million letters signed around the world. Here's the data from the social media. Here's the number of accounts mentioning FIFA and saying you people need to act. Here's the push. Here's the data. You could never do that otherwise. Once you've got data at scale, you've got ears. You've got people listening. And by the way, all these people have been talking directly to your sponsors. So, Coca-Cola has been talked about, your airline has been talked about, and you can energize the sponsors because where commercial arrangements are made that intersect with human rights injustice, then those sponsors should be accountable for that. So if I'm going to sponsor, if I own a drinks brand and I sponsor FIFA, and FIFA aren't doing something about women's rights and women are actually dying and they should be helping them, I need to be accountable as a sponsor. You need to look at what is the kind of, matrix of interests in this particular issue that are involved and that can influence. And whilst social media certainly has a lot of ills, and I am concerned about the impact on young people, without it, I think there's no way that Hakeem would be alive.
Well, I'm just blown, Darren, by that story. Every time I hear it, it just takes me back because at the end of the day, getting a community together under such immense and intense pressure and danger, it's a person's life that was at risk.
The true testament to grit and most of all, like hope. And once again, like Craig said, I think it's also by the sheer willpower of what a community is willing to do to help one another out. I think that's why there was so much conversation. And I guess you can even tell from Craig's responses a lot of times that he's grateful that we live in an era where technology is a tool or what intentions you have or what purpose you have. I think that's up to us as, to choose humanity every time. I think that's very important.
Yeah, I think behind every headline, every campaign title, there is real lives at stake.
Yeah.
And he is very, very cognizant of that. And the moves that were made, the conversations that happened, the public outreaches were all cognizant that a person's life was at stake. I think we need to really highlight a very interesting aspect, right? Craig's full of amazing stories, but those amazing stories have actually hit the big screen, right? A lot of people will be like, oh, what do you mean? I don't know any movies that have come out. But there is a documentary on Amazon Prime, which is called The Defenders. And it basically showcases this very story about Hakeem that we just spoke about and how that movie is fundamentally becoming the way in which you can dissipate this kind of stories that affect people, everyday people out there. There is a YouTube video as well of the 15 girls who escaped the Taliban, which is called Die or Die Trying, that anyone can take a look at it. And, these movies and documentaries, I think they talk about real, relatable issues, reaching out to people who might not otherwise pay attention.
Because documentaries and movies, they're stories, right? And stories are the narrative of ideas, and the ideas is what pull people together, and that's how communities form. And throughout all of this, it's good that now we have these platforms thanks to technology. And looking at things on the positive side, they are going to be more connected because of technology. We're going to be able to hear more of these stories. We're going to be more invested in these stories, or rather invested in these movements. And it gives us more avenues and more channels to pour ourselves into communities and help each other out when there's need,
Totally, totally, man. I think we should just go back into the conversation we had with Craig. I was going through your bio on your website and I noticed something. Literally everything you've touched has become a movie or a documentary or a short film.
Mm.
How'd you end up doing that? Because it's not every day. Like, you get to tell the stories and then
Yeah.
haven't come out like that.
Yeah.
But I just want to interject on that too, because I still see that as another form of advocacy and also another form of using a technological platform. I'm just interjecting, but I'll let Craig really talk about it.
No, what you're saying is right. So the thing is, that wasn't always the case. I think it was really just around the Hakeem campaign when that occurred, and it became important for me to document what I was thinking and doing and strategizing in every part of it, because I had to share with the community. The way to keep people engaged on a campaign was to keep them appraised of the campaign. So every day, so often every day, it just had to be on there saying, listen, this is what we're doing. This is what we're hearing. Let's keep going. These days in a social media context, particularly in a very short, high intensity, high volume campaign, the interaction with people through technology, through video, for example, is critically important. That's actually what technology can do. And we see that in a whole range of areas around the world. Like without technology, people can't tell their story, and their story is often one of oppression, it's one of being attacked, or it's one of being assaulted. So what had happened is, out of that, people then wanted to make documentaries and films, and that became so powerful that I just then started to leverage that into other things. It's really that simple. So now if I, for example, last year I went to Bangladesh to see Cox's Bazar, the biggest refugee camp in the world. A million people, they've largely been forgotten by the world. And so the only way to make them visible is by, bringing their story to the world. So we make a doco about that. My careers have been about sport and then broadcasting and then human rights. The intersection of all those is the most powerful. I tend to use sport to amplify. I use broadcasting to get the message to people. And I use my human rights and legal knowledge to be able to advocate in a certain way, which is always based and grounded on international law and human rights, not just what I think or what I feel, or, that I'm anti, someone else, or it's always about, this is what the rules say, this is what the world's agreed on.
Yeah.
And until you change those rules, this is what they currently are. This is the best attempt by humanity to work out how we can treat each other well. And this is what these people need to live up to right now.
Advocacy and a lot of these movements were almost impossible to get going, especially if there wasn't a channel to spread the word, to get people on board, to rally communities behind a cause. That's why I think it's amazing.
Yeah, and people need to be able to tell their own story. And the trust in legacy media around the world has, crashed, rightly, including here in Australia. And so people need a platform to tell their own story in their own way that doesn't have gatekeepers, that the language is not policed. So whether it's the Rohingya fleeing Myanmar and sharing videos about what they're facing, and these videos are often very, very confronting, of course, but it's the only way, because the Myanmar state media will not tell the story. So the only way they get the story out is actually through social media. Now, again, that brings its own problems. And we've seen this phenomenon in the last 17 months, in relation to Gaza and Palestine, for example. And the Palestinian people have been portrayed in a particular way by much of Western media anyway, including here in Australia. But what has really shaped the narrative at community level around the world, and which has shifted the Australian government into actual advocacy through the UN, has been what people have seen on social media. People can't argue with seeing children, slaughtered.
Yeah, that's true. And that's why we're moving from social media, which is very much Web 2, and now
Yeah.
moving to Web 3, where data is going to be shared personally. And it's going to push that even further, where it's more personalized, person to person. There'll be less filters of the mainstream media now. The trust value of it has gone down so much. And I think the advent of Web 3 and also with other technologies coming up, you're going to see more and more of how people express themselves and speak the truth to power.
I want to go back to the very beginning when you kind of said, when it was still Twitter, you said Jack Dorsey when he asked for an hour of your time. From a tech standpoint, what was it that you guys talked about that they actually implemented in Twitter?
That's a good question. So I spent roughly an hour with Jack here in Sydney, where he had met his Twitter staff, and then he wanted to meet with a number of influential Australians, so-called, chosen by Twitter. They said these are the people who are forward thinkers. He obviously, as he traveled the world, he wanted to know, where do we think the world's going? How's it going to impact globally? And I want to stay on top of that as Jack Dorsey, right? So, these people are in a position of such influence that they can access really anyone in the world that they need. And that's how they can stay ahead in the technological space. It's not just the best engineers, but also, they want to be in contact with the people who are thinking. So we spent an hour and we just strolled around before a function that we were doing, at which he and I were speaking for Twitter. I was speaking about the campaign and how I brought it to life. I didn't advise him of any specific tools that I needed at that time. What I said was, let's stay in contact, which we did over a long period of time, and just saying, listen, I'll have a think about what I need to be able to be more effective. But what I did was ask him the question. I said, okay, listen, you're seeing, the top minds in the world, you're seeing where technology is headed. What do we need to be worried about? And what are the biggest issues that you think are coming down the pipeline? And he said, from memory, he said one was nuclear, which was an obvious one. He said, look, I think, the way things are headed, people can access nuclear now actually through technology. And that's the biggest problem that we faced. Like, it used to be someone had a key and then someone had this or someone had that. So it was human frailty. And now what we're seeing is technology may well be in a place where it can actually just action it itself. And that's a problem. Right? Secondly, he said deep fakes is a big problem, because now you can't even be sure that, what you're seeing is real. At that time, deep fake wasn't even really a thing. And he said AI are putting, hundreds of millions of people out of work. And so he was already looking at what had happened now with Sam Altman and OpenAI, which, the reason they're looking at a UBI, a universal basic income, is of course because they realize that the technology that they're going to be making hundreds of billions, if not trillions out of, they realize it's going to put hundreds of millions of people out of work immediately. And AI is just another example of technology that can be used for good or bad. And humans need to put guardrails around. We've always had to put guardrails around technology.
I think we'd have taken a lot of your time, but because it's so interesting, and it seems like your advocacy doesn't end. What are the projects that you're working on right now?
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in, the use of technology to cut through what is now a flood of misinformation, disinformation, which is deliberate untruths and non-facts about how it can help the world deal with the impacts of climate. And what that means, what is trusted information in the world right now? At the time, perhaps more than ever, when the distrust in the traditional, or what they call legacy media, is at an all-time high. And that's where my head is at the moment. After fighting many micro campaigns, even on a global level, they're only about small issues. Now what I'm focused on is, okay, how do we agree as a species that this is the way forward in terms of what we read and see and hear and interact between ourselves?
With that, Ben, I think this was an incredible episode. We learned a lot about the power of the community, the power of the sheer will and hope of coming together for the right cause at the right time. And now more than ever, it's the most accessible to everybody. So that's it from us today.
You've been listening to Tech for Impact, brought to you by Freedom World. It's a cutting-edge technology platform dedicated to building and growing active communities on the blockchain. And who knows, you might end up creating a community to cause an impact in your specific area. This episode was hosted by me, Ben, and my co-host,
Darren.
And this episode was produced by Aaron Joseph from The Surge Online, edited by Andrew, sound design and mixing was done by Snowfer James, and the incredible music is from Kushi. Thank you for tuning in. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to share it with your friends, subscribe on the podcast, and leave us a review. And until next time, stay curious and keep making an impact.